My father died on a Wednesday morning. The call came just after sunrise. It wasn't unexpected. His illness had been a long, cruel descent, but the finality of it still landed like a physical blow. I sat on the edge of the bed, the phone cool against my ear, the world outside the window already moving, oblivious. Work felt impossibly distant. My office, the sleek, sterile tower downtown, was a million miles away from the quiet final breath I was imagining him take. I knew instinctively that I needed time, not just a day, but space to breathe, to grieve properly, to handle the practicalities that death inevitably brings. I opened my laptop, the screen a stark white in the dim bedroom light, and drafted the email to David Langston, my boss, the senior partner. I requested 2 weeks of bereavement leave, explaining the situation simply, without excessive detail. My father was gone. I needed time to bury him and help my mother navigate the immediate aftermath. David's response was swift. A one-line reply, devoid of any personal sentiment, but explicitly stating, approved. 2 weeks. Please ensure handover is complete before Friday. It wasn't warm, but it was permission. It was official. I spent the rest of that day in a haze, making arrangements, calling family, starting the painful process of sorting through a life suddenly ended. The office, for those 2 weeks, faded into a background hum. Emails piled up, but I checked them only sporadically, handling urgent queries, ensuring my team knew what to do. Grief is a peculiar thing in the corporate world. There are policies, procedures, approved durations, but there's no box to tick for the way it hollows you out, makes the mundane feel impossible, and the important feel trivial. For those 2 weeks, my priority was my family, my mother, the silent house that now felt too large. We held the funeral on a crisp autumn day. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fading leaves. I stood by the grave, watching the coffin lowered, a part of my own history settling into the ground. The 2 weeks passed with a blur of quiet conversations, shared memories, and the slow, heavy acceptance of absence. I felt raw, exposed, but also a strange sense of peace. The acute pain had dulled into a persistent ache, a quiet companion. I was ready, or as ready as I could be, to return to some semblance of normal life. I planned to go back to the office on Monday. Sunday evening, I checked my work email one last time before packing my bag. I saw the notification, an email from David Langston, time-stamped late that afternoon. The subject line was innocuous. Catch up Monday. I clicked it open. The email wasn't a catch-up request. It was brief, cold, and formal. It stated that my position had been made redundant due to restructuring and reallocation of resources. It informed me that my employment was terminated, effective immediately. There was no mention of my father, my leave, or the 2 weeks I had just spent burying him. Just sterile corporate language, delivered via email on a Sunday evening, less than 24 hours before I was due back at my desk. The initial shock was a physical jolt. Redundant. After 15 years, after an approved leave of absence for a family death? The words swam before my eyes. Then came the wave of disbelief, quickly followed by a cold, sharp anger that cut through the lingering haze of grief. They fired me while I was burying my father, despite explicitly approving my leave. It wasn't just a termination. It felt like a calculated act of cruelty, a dismissal of my loyalty, my work, and my humanity at my most vulnerable moment. I reread the email. Every word was carefully chosen, legally framed. No warmth, no apology, just the clinical execution of a decision. The calm that had settled over me after the funeral evaporated, replaced by a furious energy. This wasn't just about a job. This was about respect, about decency, about the fundamental principle that some things are sacred, even in the cutthroat world of corporate law. They thought they could discard me, just like that, at a moment when I was least equipped to fight back. They were wrong. The anger was cold, not hot. It wasn't a sudden flare, but a deep, steady burn, fueled by the injustice, and the utter lack of empathy. I looked at the email again, then at David Langston's original approval message, side by side on the screen. The contrast was stark. Approval one moment, termination the next. The timing impeccable in its callousness. They waited until I was out of the office, dealing with a personal tragedy, to deliver the blow. It was cowardly. It was calculated. And it was, I suspected, designed to catch me off guard, to make me less likely to push back. They underestimated me. That was their first mistake. The second was doing it when my emotional landscape had shifted from grief to something far more resilient and focused. Grief had softened me, made me vulnerable. This act hardened me, forged a resolve I hadn't known I possessed. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I was fighting. I printed both emails, the termination notice and the leave approval. I placed them on my desk side by side.
They were evidence.
The start of my response. Before we dive into what happened next, tell me in the comments where in the world are you watching from. It's always incredible to see how far these stories reach. The next morning, Monday, the day I was supposed to return to work, I didn't go into the office. Instead, I went to see a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but Sarah Jenkins, a sharp, no-nonsense employment attorney known for taking on powerful firms. Her office was surprisingly understated, filled with stacks of files and the quiet hum of serious work. She listened patiently, her expression neutral, as I recounted the events. My father's death, the approved leave, the Sunday evening termination email. I laid the printed emails on her desk. She picked them up, reading each one carefully. When she finished, she looked at me, her eyes direct. They waited until you were on bereavement leave for the death of your father to fire you, citing restructuring, despite approving that leave just 2 weeks prior. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, stripped bare of corporate jargon and emotional pretense. That's correct, I confirmed. I was fully expecting to return today. Did they offer you a severance package? She asked. The email mentioned standard terms, I replied, but it wasn't the point. It was the timing, and the reason. Timing is often exactly the point in these cases, Sarah said, leaning back, especially when it coincides with protected leave, which bereavement often is, depending on company policy and jurisdiction. Restructuring is the easy out, the convenient excuse. But when it happens days after approving leave for a death in the family,
Bautista. It raises questions.
significant questions. She tapped the printed emails. These are key. They establish the timeline, the approved leave, and the sudden, conveniently timed termination. She asked about my performance review history, my role, the alleged restructuring. I explained. I had consistently received positive reviews, had just taken on a new project, and had heard no prior indication of my role being at risk. The restructuring felt entirely fabricated, a flimsy veil for something else. What that something else was, I wasn't yet sure, but the gut feeling was that it wasn't about my performance or the company's structure. It was personal, or perhaps just purely opportunistic. Sarah began outlining the potential legal avenues: wrongful termination, retaliation for taking leave, potential discrimination claim if other factors were involved. Though in my case it seemed purely linked to the leave timing. The legal language was complex, but her explanation was clear and empowering. She spoke of building a case, gathering evidence, challenging their narrative. It was a path, a way to push back, not just accept the injustice. Leaving her office, I felt a shift. The passive hurt began to recede, replaced by an active sense of purpose. This wasn't just happening to me anymore. I was taking control. I was building a defense, preparing a counterattack. The corporate tower that had felt so distant now loomed large again, but not as a place of defeat. It was the battlefield. My emotional restraint, a trait I had cultivated over years in a demanding profession, was suddenly my greatest asset. I wasn't lashing out, wasn't sending furious emails or making tearful calls. I was calm, focused, and analytical. Just as I approached complex legal cases, I approached this. Identify the facts, gather evidence, build the strategy. David Langston and the firm had made a critical misjudgment. They saw my grief and assumed weakness. They saw my leave and saw an opportunity for a clean, quiet exit. They didn't see the quiet resolve beneath the surface, the steel forged in personal trials, the professional training that taught me to build a case based on evidence, not emotion. Their arrogance was their blind spot. They were about to learn that underestimating a woman who had just buried her father and been summarily discarded was a very costly mistake. I went home and began gathering every relevant document. My employment contract, performance reviews, emails related to my role, approved leave email, the termination email, company policy documents related to leave and termination. Each piece of paper, each digital file felt like a building block for the case Sarah would build. This was no longer just about getting my job back, or even just about severance. It was about accountability. It was about sending a message that treating employees with such blatant disregard for their humanity, especially in moments of profound personal difficulty, would not stand unchallenged. The quiet rage was my fuel, but the strategy was my weapon. I would use their own rules, their own documentation, their own cold process against them. Sarah Jenkins advised a period of strategic silence from my end. No communication with the firm. No responding to any attempts at contact. Should there be any beyond the termination email, my lawyer would handle everything. This silence felt unnatural, like holding my breath, but I understood its purpose. Any interaction could be used against me. Any emotional outburst could undermine my position. My strength needed to manifest as calm, measured action, executed through my legal counsel. While Sarah began her formal communication with the firm, I used the quiet time to process the emotional weight of the past few weeks. The grief for my father was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface, but it was now intertwined with a new kind of pain, the sting of betrayal and professional violation. I thought about my time at the firm, the years of dedication, the late nights, the sacrifices. It all felt cheapened by this ending. I remembered specific moments, staying up all night to file a critical brief, mentoring younger colleagues, landing a major client. Had it all meant so little? It seemed the firm's loyalty was a fragile thing, easily discarded when convenience dictated. I recalled instances where David Langston had been dismissive, subtly undermining, always seeking to reinforce his position of power. He had a way making you feel slightly less capable than you were, a common tactic among those whose own confidence is perhaps not as robust as their bluster suggests. He had a habit of taking credit for others' work, of making decisions based on expediency rather than principle. This final act felt like the culmination of his character, self-serving and devoid of genuine empathy. I remembered a conversation months prior, where we discussed an employee who needed extended medical leave. David had sighed, rolling his eyes, muttering about the inconvenience, the burden on the team. At the time, I dismissed it as typical corporate impatience. Now it felt like foreshadowing. My own approved leave, for a reason far more profound than illness, had likely been viewed through the same cold, calculating lens, an inconvenience, a problem to be eliminated. The firm's initial response to Sarah was predictable. Formal, defensive, reiterating the restructuring line, denying any connection between my termination and my approved leave. They asserted the decision had been made prior to my leave request, a lie given the email timeline, and was purely a business necessity. They were sticking to the script, the one designed to appear legitimate and ward off legal challenges. But Sarah was ready for this. She had anticipated their defense. Her next communication was sharper, presenting the timeline explicitly. Email requesting leave, approved, then termination email received during that leave, just before my planned return. She highlighted the lack of any prior performance issues or warnings, the recent assignment of significant new responsibilities, contradicting the restructuring narrative. She cited relevant case law regarding retaliation for taking protected leave. The tone was firm, factual, leaving no room for ambiguity. It was clear we weren't backing down. The silence from my end, coupled with Sarah's assertive legal steps, shifted the dynamic. The firm, used to employees quietly accepting termination packages, was now dealing with a direct, evidence-based challenge. They had expected a passive recipient of their decision. They were instead facing a strategic adversary. I imagined the conversations happening behind closed doors at the firm. David Langston, perhaps initially dismissive, now likely facing pressure from HR, or even other partners. The smug satisfaction he might have felt delivering the termination email was probably curdling into discomfort, maybe even fear. Their arrogance was being confronted with facts and legal precedent. I found a quiet strength in this knowledge. My grief was still present, a dull ache, but it no longer incapacitated me. It had been transmuted into a quiet determination. The fight wasn't loud or dramatic. It was methodical, strategic, and deeply personal. Each step forward Sarah took on my behalf felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. They had tried to discard. They had underestimated the power of principle, the resilience forged in adversity, and the simple, undeniable truth contained in 2 pieces of paper, the leave approval and the termination notice. These documents, evidence of their calculated actions, were becoming their undoing. I focused on the process, trusting Sarah, allowing myself to feel the satisfaction of knowing that their callous act would not go unanswered. The corporate machine, built on power dynamics and often lacking in empathy, was finding itself challenged by a single individual armed with facts and righteous indignation, channeled through the precise language of the law. As Sarah engaged in back and forth with the firm's lawyers, I occupied myself with putting my life back together outside of the corporate structure I had known for so long. I continued to support my mother, finding solace in the shared quiet of her home. I started to explore other possibilities for my career, realizing that the path I had been on, while secure, had perhaps narrowed my perspective. This forced disruption, born of cruelty, might paradoxically open new doors. I found a different kind of empowerment in realizing that my identity wasn't solely tied to that office tower. While I focused on the future, I also remained keenly aware of the legal battle unfolding. Sarah kept me informed, but the details were often sparse, deliberately so. This was a negotiation, now a dance of legal positioning and leverage. The firm maintained their stance, but their arguments were weakening under the weight of the evidence. Sarah had highlighted the inconsistencies in their restructuring claim, pointing out recent hires in similar roles, and the fact that my responsibilities hadn't disappeared, but had been reassigned to less experienced colleagues. The more they defended their position, the more holes appeared in their story. I learned that David Langston was becoming increasingly agitated by the situation. He had likely expected me to just fade away, accept a modest settlement, and disappear. The fact that I had immediately lawyered up and was challenging him directly was clearly not part of his plan. He was being forced to justify his decision, to defend actions he probably thought he could get away with easily. There was a quiet internal satisfaction in knowing this. Not a loud celebratory triumph, but a deep, steady warmth that countered the coldness of his initial act. He had tried to hurt me at my weakest point, and instead, he had inadvertently triggered a response that was now causing him significant discomfort and legal exposure. My former colleagues, sensing the tension and perhaps hearing whispers, reached out tentatively. Some were cautious, worried about being associated with someone challenging the firm. Others were quietly supportive, expressing shock at how I had been treated. Their reactions confirmed what I already knew. My firing had been perceived internally as unjust and poorly handled. This informal feedback, while not admissible evidence, validated my emotional response and the righteousness of my fight. It wasn't just me. Others saw the callousness too. The firm, through their lawyers, eventually shifted tactics. The outright denial began to soften, replaced by offers of a larger severance package, contingent on my signing a non-disclosure agreement and releasing them from all liability. This was a clear sign that they were feeling the pressure. They wanted to make the problem go away quietly. But I wasn't interested in just a payout. While financial compensation was necessary, the principle was paramount. They needed to acknowledge in some form that what they did was wrong, and David Langston needed to face consequences, not just hide behind the corporate veil. Sarah advised me on the offers. They were increasing, but they still fell short of what she believed we could achieve, not just financially, but in terms of accountability. We discussed the possibility of taking the case to court, the risks and rewards involved. It was a heavy decision. A court case would be draining, public, and unpredictable, but it would also force them to defend their actions under oath. It would expose the truth of their decision-making. The silence from my end continued, punctuated only by Sarah's strategic communications. I learned to live in this state of quiet anticipation. The slow burn of the legal process mirroring the controlled anger I felt. Every delay from their side, every weak argument they presented, only strengthened my resolve. They had expected me to be incapacitated by grief, easy to dismiss. They had mistaken quiet dignity for weakness. They were learning slowly and painfully the depth of my resilience and the strength of a case built on undeniable facts. My father's memory, interwoven with this fight for justice, became a quiet source of strength. I was fighting not just for myself, but for the principle of being treated with basic respect and dignity, especially during moments of profound personal loss. This fight, in its own way, was a tribute to him. The offers from the firm continued to escalate, a clear indication that they were becoming increasingly anxious to settle. Sarah was skilled at reading their signals, knowing precisely when to push and when to hold firm. Their legal arguments were wearing thin. The more they tried to justify firing someone who was on approved bereavement leave for burying their parent, the more indefensible their position became. The internal inconsistency of their restructuring claim was glaring. Sarah had obtained internal documents, obtained through discovery, a painstaking process that directly contradicted their narrative, showing that the decision regarding my role was made after my leave request was approved, not before. Evidence, quiet and factual, was proving to be the most potent weapon. It stripped away their corporate facade, exposing the cynical timing of their action. I remember Sarah explaining the concept of pretext. That's what their restructuring was. A false reason given to hide the real, potentially illegal reason, retaliation for taking leave. We were building a strong case that their stated reason was a pretext, and the true reason was tied to my leave. This legal framework resonated deeply. It articulated the gut feeling of injustice I had experienced, that the reason they gave was not the real reason, that something far more calculated and less defensible was at play. The slow pace of the legal process, while sometimes frustrating, was also allowing the pressure on the firm to build. Every communication from Sarah was a reminder that this wasn't going away, that they were accountable. I imagined the billable hours piling up for their legal team, the internal meetings dissecting a situation that should have been a simple, quiet termination, the discomfort of facing the undeniable timeline. My quiet resolve was translating into concrete pressure on their system. I was no longer just an employee they had dismissed. I was a legal problem, a potential public relations nightmare, a case study in how not to handle employee relations. David Langston. I heard through the grapevine, my supportive former colleagues proved invaluable sources of carefully vetted information, was reportedly furious. He saw the situation as a personal attack, a failure on my part to simply move on. His arrogance prevented him from seeing his own role in creating the problem. He couldn't grasp that his callousness had consequences. He couldn't understand that treating people like disposable resources would eventually backfire. This inability to understand empathy or accountability was in itself a form of weakness. My emotional state continued to be one of controlled intensity. The initial raw grief had settled into a permanent part of me, a quiet sorrow. The anger over the firing had matured into a cold determination for justice. I wasn't driven by a desire for explosive revenge, but by a need for validation and accountability. They needed to be shown that their actions were unacceptable, that employees, even when grieving, have rights and dignity that cannot be disregarded. The final stages of negotiation felt like a high-stakes chess game. Sarah presented our terms. They weren't just financial. We sought a specific, written acknowledgement related to the timing of my termination, relative to my leave, structured carefully to be acceptable in legal terms. but clear in its implication. We also sought specific non-monetary concessions, details that would serve as a quiet victory, a symbolic win that went beyond the money. The firm resisted, then conceded on some points, then resisted again. The process was arduous, requiring patience and unwavering resolve. There were moments of doubt, moments when the sheer effort of the fight felt overwhelming, layered as it was on top of my personal grief. But then I would look at the initial emails, the stark contrast between the approved leave and the sudden termination, and the quiet anger would reignite, fueling my determination. This wasn't just a job loss, it was a violation of trust, a dismissal of my worth at a moment of profound vulnerability. That could not and would not stand. The negotiations reached a critical point. The firm's offers were now substantial, reflecting their desire to avoid court and minimize the potential damage. Sarah presented their latest proposal. It was a significant financial settlement, far more than a standard severance package would have been. It also included language acknowledging the timeline of my termination in relation to my leave, carefully worded to satisfy their legal need for deniability, while implicitly validating my claim of improper timing. There was also an agreement for a neutral reference, a small but important detail for my future career. Sarah explained the terms, the pros and cons of accepting versus continuing the fight. Going to court would be a gamble. We had a strong case, but juries are unpredictable, and the process would be long, stressful, and public. Settling offered certainty, closure, and significant compensation, while still achieving a form of accountability. The decision was mine. I took the proposal home. I didn't look at the numbers first, although they were substantial. I read the language, the carefully constructed sentences that danced around a direct apology but acknowledged the sequence of events that had caused me such pain and injustice. It wasn't the outright admission of guilt I might have dreamed of in moments of intense anger, but it was an official acknowledgement from the firm, through their lawyers, that the timing was at the very least questionable enough to warrant this outcome. I thought about my father, about the weeks of grief and struggle, about the quiet strength I had found in pushing back against their cruelty. This fight had been a part of my grieving process, a way of channeling the pain into something active and purposeful. It had shown me my own resilience, my ability to stand firm against powerful forces. I thought about David Langston. He would likely never face public condemnation, never truly understand the depth of his actions, but he would know, and the firm's leadership would know, that his decision had cost them dearly. Not just financially, but in terms of the disruption it had caused, the resources it had consumed, and the quiet ripple effect it had within the firm. That quiet consequence, the knowledge that their callousness had rebounded upon them, was a form of justice. The financial settlement would provide security, time to find the right next step without rushing into something out of desperation. The acknowledgement, however couched in legal terms, was a validation of my experience. It said, without saying explicitly, that what they did was not okay. I discussed it with my mother, who had witnessed my struggle firsthand. She was pragmatic, seeing the value of certainty and the opportunity to move forward. She reminded me that my father would have wanted me to find peace and build a new future, not remain consumed by anger or a draining legal battle. Her wisdom helped clarify my decision. The goal had never been pure, destructive revenge. It had been accountability, validation, and the reclamation of my own power. This settlement, while not a perfect outcome in an ideal world, achieved those goals effectively and with a measure of dignity. It was a strategic victory, won not with shouting or aggression, but with quiet resolve, meticulous evidence gathering, and the skilled application of legal pressure. I called Sarah. I told her I accepted the terms. Her voice was calm and professional, confirming she would finalize the agreement. There was no triumph in her tone, just the quiet satisfaction of a job done well. The legal battle was over. The chapter was closing. I signed the settlement agreement in Sarah's office a few days later. The language was dense and complex, but the core was simple. I received a substantial amount, and they received my legal release. As I signed, I felt a sense of closure, not just on the legal case, but on the emotional turmoil of the past months. It wasn't a moment of explosive triumph, but a quiet, deep satisfaction. They had underestimated me, tried to discard me at my lowest point, and I had used their own system, their own rules, their own documented actions, to hold them accountable. Walking out of Sarah Jenkins' office for the last time, carrying the signed settlement papers, felt like emerging from a long, necessary storm. The weight I hadn't fully realized I was carrying began to lift. The legal battle had been a consuming focus, a strategic channel for the complex emotions swirling within me: grief, anger, injustice, determination. Now that focus could shift. The quiet satisfaction remained. A steady ember. It wasn't loud or boastful, but a deep internal knowing that I had stood up for myself, refused to be a victim, and achieved a form of justice through perseverance and strategy. My dignity, which they had attempted to strip away with their callous act, felt fully restored. I had been underestimated, seen as vulnerable, and easily dismissed. That underestimation had been their critical error. They had mistaken my quiet nature and emotional restraint for weakness, failing to see the steel beneath the surface, the resilience forged in facing life's inevitable hardships, culminating in my father's death. They hadn't counted on the combination of quiet intelligence, professional competence which allowed me to understand their system, and a deeply personal sense of principle. The financial settlement provided a solid foundation for the future. It wasn't get-rich money, but it was enough to provide security, time, and options. It represented the cost of their callousness, a tangible consequence for their actions. More importantly, the process itself had been transformative. I had learned invaluable lessons about standing up for myself, the power of evidence, the strategic use of legal process, and the importance of choosing your battles and fighting them on your own terms. I thought about David Langston again, not with anger, but with a kind of detached pity. He was a man who operated from a place of perceived power, but his power was contingent on others' silence and compliance. When faced with someone who refused to be silenced, who challenged him based on facts and principles, his authority crumbled. He was a bully, exposed and contained by the very system he thought he could manipulate with impunity. He had won a battle temporarily removing me from his immediate vicinity, but lost the war for control and reputation. My future felt open, full of possibilities I hadn't considered before. The corporate ladder, which had seemed like the only path for so long, no longer held the same allure. I was free to explore roles and environments that aligned better with my values, where empathy and basic human decency were not seen as inconvenient liabilities. The experience had refined my understanding of what truly mattered in a workplace and in life. This entire ordeal, born from a moment of profound personal loss and professional betrayal, had ultimately become a journey of empowerment. It was a quiet internal empowerment, built not on external validation, but on the knowledge of my own strength, resilience, and unwavering commitment to doing what was right. The pain of losing my father remained, a quiet, permanent presence, but it was no longer compounded by the anger and injustice of the firing. I had channeled that energy into action, achieving a resolution that honored my experience and affirmed my worth. I walked towards the future, head held high, grounded in the knowledge that even in the face of cruelty and underestimation, one could find the strength to fight back, to seek accountability, and ultimately, to reclaim one's own narrative and dignity. The silence was not defeat. It was strategic. The calm was not weakness. It was controlled power. And the quiet fight had ended in a victory, not of loud triumph, but of deep, personal satisfaction and earned peace. I had buried my father, and then, with quiet resolve, I had buried the injustice.